We are all ships rising on a turquoise tide, headed ever closer towards winning the next general election.
We know now that Angela Rayner has gone and gone, because she's no longer the Deputy Prime Minister. She is no longer the Housing Prime Minister, and she is no longer the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party. We do not yet know what is in the report of Sir Laurie Magnus. One assumes it didn't come up smelling of roses, and I think we, the public, need to know what those conclusions are. But this does mean, of course, a deputy leadership election now on the horizon for the Labour Party. And not just that, we understand as well that next week Sir Keir Starmer, in the wake of all of this, may be conducting a reshuffle of his cabinet and making a few peerages. Let's speak now to Kate Ferguson, political editor at The Sun on Sunday.
In a political clash that left the world watching, Keir Starmer found himself under fire like never before. Donald Trump, blunt, fearless and unfiltered, confronted the UK Labour leader with a barrage of questions and accusations, exposing contradictions that Starmer could no longer evade. What started as a press meeting quickly spiralled into a high-stakes showdown, with the former president cutting through political niceties to call out inconsistencies, half-truths and apparent hypocrisy. Every word, every gesture and every pause seemed to tilt the balance of power, putting Starmer on the defensive and leaving his supporters stunned. The intensity was palpable, the tension undeniable, and for those watching, it was clear this was more than a routine exchange. It was a defining moment that could shape Starmer's leadership for years to come. In a political clash that left the world watching, Keir Starmer found himself under fire like never before. Donald Trump, blunt, fearless and unfiltered, confronted the UK Labour leader with a barrage of questions and accusations, exposing contradictions that Starmer could no longer evade. What started as a press meeting quickly spiralled into a high-stakes showdown, with the former president cutting through political niceties to call out inconsistencies, half-truths and apparent hypocrisy. Every word, every gesture and every pause seemed to tilt the balance of power, putting Starmer on the defensive and leaving his supporters stunned. The intensity was palpable, the tension undeniable, and for those watching, it was clear this was more than a routine exchange. It was a defining moment that could shape Starmer's leadership for years to come. From the moment the cameras began rolling, it was clear that this encounter would be unlike any other. Keir Starmer, known for his careful, measured approach, entered the room with the air of someone prepared to project calm and confidence. But Donald Trump, with his trademark directness, immediately turned the spotlight onto Starmer's inconsistencies, forcing the Labour leader into a corner where politeness and caution could no longer shield him. Trump's approach was relentless. He pressed on issues that Starmer had previously navigated with careful wording, from free speech to political manoeuvring, leaving Starmer struggling to maintain composure. As the exchange unfolded, it became apparent that this wasn't just a diplomatic dialogue. It was a test of character, strategy and credibility. Starmer's attempts to reassure the audience and deflect tough questions often fell flat, creating the impression of someone trying too hard to appear balanced while simultaneously avoiding uncomfortable truths. The contrast between Trump's aggressive, unfiltered style and Starmer's controlled, cautious demeanour created a palpable tension, one that kept viewers on edge. This was not just a clash of politicians, it was a confrontation of personas, where body language, tone and phrasing mattered as much as policy positions. Starmer's carefully rehearsed lines, his nods to history, and his strategic mentions of revered figures like Winston Churchill felt increasingly like defensive manoeuvres designed to anchor himself amidst the storm rather than reflect genuine conviction. Trump, ever the master of reading the room, seemed to recognise this immediately. Every attempt by Starmer to shift the narrative or soften his stance was met with a pointed question, a subtle challenge, or a remark designed to expose the cracks in his carefully constructed image. Observers noted that Starmer, while attempting to present himself as composed and statesmanlike, frequently appeared hesitant, choosing words that could appeal to multiple audiences but ultimately satisfied none. The press conference quickly transformed into a chess match where each comment, each gesture, and each hesitation carried weight. Trump's supporters immediately interpreted his probing style as a display of dominance, a demonstration that he could spot political posturing from miles away. Meanwhile, critics of Starmer began questioning his credibility, pointing out the stark contrast between his public statements and his current diplomatic gestures. It wasn't merely about the specific policies under discussion, it was about perception, authenticity, and leadership. The tension peaked when the conversation shifted to free speech in the UK, a topic Trump has consistently highlighted as a critical issue. Starmer attempted to defend the state of expression in Britain, insisting that the country upheld fundamental freedoms. Yet Trump's sharp, unrelenting follow-ups painted a very different picture. Arrests over social media posts, the online safety bill's potential overreach, and a growing culture of self-censorship. The audience could sense that Starmer's explanations were being dissected, scrutinised, and challenged at every turn. It was clear that the Labour leader was walking a tightrope, trying to reassure international observers, appease his domestic supporters, and avoid alienating potential allies. But Trump's presence, his direct questioning, and his ability to spotlight contradictions made this a near impossible task. As the press conference continued, the optics of the interaction began to dominate headlines. Starmer's praise for historical figures and careful diplomatic nods, once intended to project wisdom and continuity, now felt staged and calculated. Trump, never one to miss a chance to call out perceived insincerity, repeatedly highlighted the inconsistencies, creating an atmosphere where Starmer's words were questioned before they could even settle. Every pause, every measured response, and every attempt at deflection became ammunition for critics, while supporters of Trump saw validation in his uncompromising style. The stakes were enormous, not just for public perception, but for Starmer's standing within his party and among voters who demand authenticity and consistency. The press conference revealed more than policy disagreements. It laid bare the fragile balance Starmer must maintain between political calculation and genuine leadership. By the time the exchange concluded, it was evident that this encounter would be dissected for days, weeks, and potentially months, shaping narratives about Starmer's credibility, Trump's influence, and the intricate dance of modern politics. Every word spoken, every nuance displayed was a clue to the public about who these leaders really are and how far they would go to defend their positions, reputations, and visions for the future. The confrontation escalated when Trump shifted the focus directly onto Starmer's credibility, pressing him on the discrepancies between his past statements and his current diplomatic gestures. Starmer, who had spent years cultivating a careful image of reasoned judgment and measured leadership, found himself exposed under Trump's relentless scrutiny. The former president's questions weren't casual or rhetorical. They were designed to cut through layers of political polish and reveal what he perceived as inconsistencies and half-truths. Starmer's attempts to navigate these challenges revealed the delicate, often precarious balancing act he had undertaken, presenting a competent statesman-like persona to the international community while trying not to alienate domestic critics who are deeply sceptical of his motives. Every statement he made seemed to be analysed not just for content, but for intent. When the discussion turned to Starmer's handling of domestic issues, particularly controversial legislation like the online safety bill, Trump highlighted how such policies had inadvertently restricted free speech, a fundamental principle he continually champions. Starmer tried to reassure the audience that freedom of expression remained protected in the UK, but the stark reality presented by Trump's pointed examples created an undeniable tension. Arrests over social media posts, restrictive online regulations, and high-profile cases of censorship provided Trump with a framework to question Starmer's leadership credibility. The Labour leader's careful, rehearsed phrasing could not withstand the pressure of someone unafraid to call out inconsistencies, and each defensive manoeuvre appeared less like principled reasoning and more like political survival. Analysts watching the exchange noted that Starmer's gestures, pauses, and selective phrasing betrayed an underlying discomfort. In contrast, Trump's body language, assertive tone, and willingness to confront uncomfortable truths radiated authority. It was a stark contrast. Starmer, the cautious strategist, versus Trump, the confrontational disruptor. Observers quickly interpreted this dynamic as more than a simple policy disagreement. It was a public demonstration of power, influence, and the ability to control the narrative. Every nod, every pause, and every carefully chosen word by Starmer seemed calculated to avoid missteps. Yet in doing so, it amplified the perception that he was on the defensive, hesitant, and vulnerable. The optics were not in Starmer's favour. What made the exchange particularly compelling was the stark historical context Trump invoked. He repeatedly referenced Starmer's previous criticisms of Trump himself, as well as inconsistencies in his stances on international diplomacy and domestic governance. Just a few years ago, Starmer had openly criticised Trump, framing him as a destabilising figure and questioning the wisdom of engagement. Today, however, he found himself extending an official invitation backed by a letter from King Charles, attempting to frame the encounter as an opportunity for constructive dialogue. This abrupt shift did not go unnoticed. Critics immediately seized on it as evidence of opportunism, calling into question Starmer's consistency and authenticity. Supporters, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile the Labour leader's current diplomatic gestures with his prior rhetoric, creating a tension that could undermine public trust. Trump's approach was simple but devastatingly effective. He highlighted discrepancies, questioned motives, and emphasised the real-world implications of Starmer's decisions. By doing so, he forced the Labour leader into reactive mode, making him respond to challenges rather than proactively presenting his agenda. It was a dynamic that reinforced a key narrative. Starmer's leadership, while carefully curated, could appear fragile under direct confrontation. One of the most striking moments occurred when Trump directly questioned Starmer's handling of domestic free speech issues and his interactions with international figures. Starmer attempted to frame his responses diplomatically, emphasising balance and reason, but Trump's unfiltered style cut through the veneer, exposing gaps and contradictions. Observers noted that Starmer's reliance on scripted responses, historical references, and carefully chosen language, while ordinarily a strength, now seemed to highlight the contrast between performance and substance. The Labour leader's carefully cultivated image of thoughtful leadership clashed with Trump's aggressive, confrontational approach, creating an atmosphere that was both tense and compelling. As the exchange unfolded, it became clear that the stakes were not simply political optics or public perception. They were about credibility, trust, and the future trajectory of Starmer's leadership. Every challenge Trump posed forced Starmer to reconcile past statements with present actions, and in doing so, revealed vulnerabilities that might otherwise have remained hidden. The audience was left with a clear impression this was more than a press conference, it was a trial by fire, where consistency, authenticity, and political skill were being tested under intense scrutiny. Starmer's careful navigation of diplomacy, previously an asset, now seemed to amplify the perception of caution bordering on indecision. Meanwhile, Trump's relentless questioning, combined with his direct, unapologetic demeanour, reinforced the narrative of him as a disruptor, someone unafraid to expose contradictions and hold leaders accountable in real time. For viewers, this clash underscored the delicate balance between appearances and reality in modern politics. Starmer's attempts to maintain composure, appear statesmanlike, and project authority were continuously challenged, creating suspense, uncertainty, and a sense that every word spoken carried lasting consequences. It became evident that this encounter would not simply fade from public memory, it would be dissected, analysed, and debated, serving as a benchmark for how Starmer's leadership handles direct confrontation, public scrutiny, and the unavoidable consequences of political calculation. The pressure on Keir Starmer intensified as the confrontation deepened, with Donald Trump methodically exposing the gaps between the Labour leader's rhetoric and his actions. Every carefully crafted statement from Starmer was met with a pointed follow-up, each designed to test the integrity of his claims. When the discussion returned to free speech and the online safety bill, Trump highlighted cases where individuals had faced severe penalties for what many would consider trivial online activity. Starmer attempted to argue that the legislation was necessary to protect citizens and maintain public order, but the contrast between his words and the growing list of arrests created a jarring inconsistency. Observers quickly noted that Starmer's calm, controlled demeanour, usually his strongest asset, was beginning to fray under the weight of Trump's relentless scrutiny. The tension was tangible, and it became increasingly clear that Starmer's usual political toolkit, careful phrasing, historical references and controlled gestures, was insufficient to deflect the directness of Trump's approach. The former president's ability to cut through layers of political language, combined with his readiness to call out contradictions, created a moment of vulnerability that few had seen from the UK leader before. As the questions grew more direct, Starmer found himself defending positions he had previously shifted or softened, raising doubts about his consistency and credibility. What made this confrontation particularly striking was the public dimension. Every hesitation, every carefully worded phrase, and every defensive posture was visible to millions, creating an intense spotlight on Starmer's leadership. Analysts observed that his strategy of balancing diplomacy with cautious engagement now appeared reactive rather than proactive. While Starmer attempted to maintain an appearance of statesmanship, the pressure revealed cracks in his narrative, providing Trump with opportunities to expose perceived hypocrisy. One key moment came when Trump directly questioned Starmer's past statements regarding international diplomacy. A few years prior, Starmer had openly criticised Trump's approach, warning of instability and potential risks in engagement. Today, however, he was extending official invitations and diplomatic courtesies, framing the encounter as a gesture of constructive dialogue. This abrupt reversal did not go unnoticed, and it quickly became a focal point for critics who accused Starmer of opportunism. The contrast between past criticism and present diplomacy created an impression that Starmer was willing to recalibrate his positions to suit immediate strategic goals rather than adhere to consistent principles. Trump, ever adept at exploiting inconsistencies, emphasised this point repeatedly, creating a sense of tension that reverberated through the press, political analysts, and the public. The exchange also highlighted Starmer's challenge in managing domestic perception while engaging on the international stage. While his diplomatic gestures might have been intended to project pragmatism and flexibility, they were simultaneously scrutinised for authenticity. Trump's direct, unfiltered approach forced Starmer to confront the consequences of his past positions and current reversals, creating a dynamic where political theatre and leadership credibility collided. Observers noted that Starmer's reliance on controlled, measured delivery, once a hallmark of his public image, now seemed almost performative, as if he were constantly calculating how to appease multiple audiences at once. Every smile, every pause, and every nod appeared to be weighed against how it would be perceived, and in doing so, he appeared less decisive and more cautious under pressure. The confrontation also underscored a broader narrative about leadership in an era of instant scrutiny. Trump's ability to spot perceived insincerity, inconsistencies, and calculated moves forced Starmer into a reactive position, challenging the Labour leader to reconcile his past statements with his current diplomacy in real time. The stakes extended beyond this single press interaction. They spoke to Starmer's overall image as a leader, capable of navigating both domestic expectations and international relations. Each question, each challenge, and each exposed inconsistency added layers to the public's understanding of Starmer's political persona. By the time the discussion moved to Starmer's policy reversals and sudden gestures of engagement with Trump, it became evident that his credibility was under intense examination. Supporters and critics alike could see that the Labour leader's careful balance of diplomacy and domestic reassurance was being tested in ways few encounters had before. The press conference had evolved from a formal discussion into a high-stakes evaluation of Starmer's authenticity, judgment, and political acumen. Trump's unyielding style contrasted sharply with Starmer's cautious approach. reinforcing a narrative of confrontation, exposure, and the harsh realities of leadership under scrutiny. By the end of this section of the exchange, it was clear that Starmer's carefully managed public persona was being dissected for all to see. The implications extended beyond immediate optics. They touched on questions of consistency, reliability, and the ability to lead under pressure. Every word Starmer spoke, every gesture he made, and every calculated pause was now part of a public record that could shape perceptions of his leadership for months to come. The encounter made one thing undeniable. In a high-pressure confrontation, the difference between perception and reality can define a political career. And in this case, Starmer was facing that challenge head-on, exposed by a figure unafraid to cut through the veneer and reveal inconsistencies in plain sight.